Where is that?
In Berkeley, which is
Okay,
kind of where I live. Yeah.
right.
Yeah,
Oh, I must be in two. Okay, whatever. I'm not
Yeah.
starting.
Moses is really good. Really
So
good.
good.
Okay, let's see. All right, I'm gonna let a bunch of folks in here. Nice. Hello, everybody. Okay. Hi, everybody. We'll wait just one more minute and see if anyone else comes into the room here. But welcome to our Joe Brainard, the Complete Sea Comics party panel. It's really good to see some of your names, and really glad you could take some time this afternoon, this evening to hang out with us and be part of this conversation. Okay. So this is Joe Brainard's Complete Sea Comics, a panel discussion. And one second here. Okay. So we've got a little comics party for everyone this evening, featuring a discussion around the book The Complete Sea Comics by Joe Brainard, recently published by the New York Review of Books under the editorial guidance of Ron Padgett. My name is Nick Sturm, and I'm co-director with Rosa Campbell of the Network for New York School Studies, an international organization of writers, artists, and scholars with wide-ranging interests in 20th and 21st century poetry, poetics, and interdisciplinary aesthetic practices, including the type of publication we're going to talk about tonight, this interdisciplinary comic experiment. Established in 2018, the Network for New York School Studies hosts free, regular online events like this one, along with in-person symposia, including past gatherings in London, New York City, and Paris. Rosa and I will be hosting another in-person symposium in Scotland at the University of Edinburgh in July of this year. Another quick note, the network's next online event will be on March 26th. That'll be a 2-hour marathon reading of poems by Frank O'Hara on the eve of what would have been O'Hara's 100th birthday. That event will feature about 20 poets from across the United States and the UK, each reading a different O'Hara poem, and we'll have more information on that event available soon. Okay. So as someone who's been thinking about researching and enjoying Joe Brainard's writing and art for many years, including as many Brainard aficionados tend to do, getting Brainard tattoos, I'm really excited that we're able to host this panel of fellow poets, scholars, and fans who also love and enjoy and think about Joe Brainard. Tyhe Cooper, David Hobbs, and Tausif Noor, to talk about and celebrate the publication of the complete Sea Comics by the New York Review of Books. Assembled under the editorial guidance of Ron Padgett, the Complete Sea Comics gives us access to the two issues of Brainard's Sea Comics, originally published in 1964 and 1965 as a kind of spin-off from Ted Berrigan's Sea, a Journal of Poetry. And this is the kind of literary recovery project that I really just love, bringing hard to find primary sources back into circulation for new readers, starting new conversations. In this case, at last, we have all of these weird, surreal, hilarious, and off-kilter comic forms that Brainard made in collaboration with poets like John Ashbery, Kenward Elmsley, Frank O'Hara, and Barbara Guest, bending the popular genre of the comic and the medium of the comic book within the experimental rush of the mid-60s New York school. As many of you already know, Brainard's comics are easy to love. fun to return to, and endlessly open to aesthetic and critical attention. I've used C Comics many times with freshmen in my first year writing classes, and they love them too. They're fizzy and playful, they're artfully self-conscious, and they continue to operate within a kind of interdisciplinary no man's land, often treated, often not treated as literary objects by literary scholars, and often not treated as a core part of Brainerd's artistic production by art critics. I'm sure that our panelists tonight, each in their own way, will help to push the ways we think about Brainerd's comics through this book. So, the layout for tonight, I'll introduce everyone here at the beginning quickly. First Ty, then David, then Tausif. When our three speakers are done, they'll have a conversation that grows out of their contributions, which will lead naturally into a discussion involving everyone who's here. Please feel free to post questions in the chat during the event for a Q&A following the discussion. We're aiming for a 60-minute event in total, but it's completely okay if we go over that hour. Throughout the discussion, you'll find links to recent work by each of our guests popping up in the chat, so please check out their writing. Okay, so first, Tyhe Cooper is a writer working in experimental prose and poetry. His work has been published in the Brooklyn Rail, the Poetry Project newsletter, Peach Mag, Trilobite Bond, and elsewhere. They are the production editor at the Brooklyn Rail, and their Book of Joke was published by Slab Editions in 2024. Ty also hosts a birthday bash reading for Joe Brainard every year at Unnameable Books in Brooklyn, which is this incredible thing that he does. Ty has that type of personal, obsessive, completist, loving literary historical imagination that we need more of. So if you're in New York, please support Ty's organizing and head to Unnameable next Wednesday, March 11th, for what would have been Brainard's 84th birthday. David Hobbs is Associate Professor of English at the University of Lethbridge in Southern Alberta. He writes about poetry for The Nation and is finishing his first book, What Can You Do Alone? Lyric Sociality and the Global Depression. He is also a George Oppen head, having edited the book 21 Poems, published by New Directions, utilizing a set of typewritten poems by Oppen that David found in Ezra Pound's papers at the Beinecke. I'm so happy to have David here, who I met recently in person for the first time, spending an afternoon walking through a Robert Rauschenberg exhibit. David is a joy and also has a really cute dog. Tausif Noor, joining us from California, is a critic, curator, and PhD candidate in history of art at UC Berkeley. His criticism and essays, for which he received a 2022 Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant and the 2023 Grace Dudley Arts Writers Prize from the Robert B. Silvers Foundation, appear in journals and periodicals, including Art History, Art Margins, Art Forum, The New Yorker, and The New York Times, as well as catalogs and edited volumes. He's currently curatorial associate at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. And some of you also might be familiar with Tausif's incredible essay about Alice Notley, published in the Yale Review in 2024. I've been hoping to collaborate with him for a long time, and so I'm glad it could occur around the sign of Brainerd. And with that, I'll hand it over to Ty to tell us more about Brainerd's comics in this new edition of the Complete C Comics.
Uh, Thank you so much, Nick, for putting this together. I'm really excited to hear everyone talk about Joe. I love talking about Joe. I do it every chance I get, both in venues such as this one and in conversations where people are begging me to stop. Um, I'm especially excited to get to do that with people who are new to me. So I'm really excited about today. Uh, I've spent a lot of time thinking about Joe, and I, for this, kind of wanted to be really specific about what the comics and specifically this publication of the comics allow for us to do that maybe we couldn't do before. These comics are hard to find, and this reprint prints them at a resolution that you're able to really get into. I was able to get really close and look to see whether a speck on the page was really a speck or just a mimeo error or what. So I'm really excited about this. And with that in mind, I'm going to focus my remarks today pretty narrowly around Joe's use of arrows, parentheticals, and quotation marks and how those things are connected. So I'm going to share my screen. Can we see this? Perfect. Uh, Joe Brainard points out the obvious. Throughout the enormous catalog of Joe Brainard's work, the C comics, his collage, paintings, assemblages, writing, etc., he maintains a pointed interest in the right here. Using quotation marks, parentheticals, and arrows, he emphasizes, directs, corrects, revels, reveals. One of my favorite visual works of Joe's is his 1963 self-portrait, made while he was living in Boston, the year before the first C Comics was published. Written in the negative space within an oval surrounding the graphite and colored pencil self-portrait, the somewhat sporadically placed text reads in turns, "A clear sky. That's what's important nowadays in Boston, where everyone owns a raincoat but me, Joe. Me, Joe Brainard, on this day, Tuesday, January 28th, 1963, who loves snow, Pat, Ted, peanut butter, and Dostoevsky." That parenthetical Joe and that arrow always get me. For years, I've been pointing out this as my favorite work and that as my favorite thing about it. Not only because they're so classically and touchingly Joe, who loves snow, Pat, Ted, peanut butter, but because that parenthetical and arrow convey something singular in Joe's work, a specific rhythm and a mix of humility and pride. Even within a self-portrait, he's nudge-winking his own presence, pointing himself out in a way that is both showy and shy. In a page of collaboration with Edwin Denby from C Comics #1, wherein Denby is billed, and you can see this at the bottom of the page here, without correction or arrow this time, as Edwin Demby, Joe's arrows read as devices of movement and space. Errors and scribbles are left unmarked, with only 3 arrows on the page, each acting independently. One sits within a small negative space heart next to the word love, written in a strong, sharp block lettering, pointing from within the heart to the very word, or perhaps just to the curve of the heart itself. In this way, the arrow is both directive and yet unfrenetic. It seems to slow the eye by aiming it, rather than moving it along. The following panel, titled Joy, directs the reader from Joy to 3 post-stick figure proto-girls leaping in unison, their cartoon legs bowed to each side, exclaiming the last 4 words of Denby's brief assessment of Maya sculpture. The arrow seems to point both to the girls and to nothing, to a pause in the page, one of the few areas left unmarked. The arrows also serve a typographical purpose throughout the comics, used to demarcate or draw attention to bylines. In this, we can see the arrow as having entered Joe's grammar, his internal spatial and typographical logic, which readers can see displayed in NYRB's complete C comics more readily than in any other reproductions of Joe's work yet. The comics are a trove not only of collaboration and illustration, but of keys with which to decipher, by which I mean enjoy, Joe's very specific codes. Other arrows have the purpose of moving things along, as in the second page of this same collaboration between Denby and Brainard, in which the arrows point from one word to the next, falling down the page. Practice every day. Again, even these serve a dual purpose, or at least see dual fruits. While directing the eye and possibly moving the reader forward, they also constitute a pause in reading, where you would otherwise just read the words as they go, practice every day. Here you read the arrows, resulting in something more like practice every day. This is one place where we can see the arrow operating similarly to Joe's quotation marks and parentheticals in his written and independent work, as well as in his letters, which were published last year. Yeah. Some quotation marks and parentheticals, sometimes used in combination, are used to include onomatopoeia, as in a 1978 letter to Robert Butts, where Joe writes, "Let me thank you also for the money and the little books. Money, well, you know money, i.e. slurp. Slurp, as an onomatopoeic device, occurs in other works as well. In other instances, they function more colloquially, to cast doubt or importance upon certain words or phrases, as in this line from May Die, written in January 1964. Quote, I do not have money, but I find that when I do get money, it doesn't matter. I couldn't care less that I didn't have it before I got it. This particular construction, get money, occurs more than once in different writings and letters. We can see Joe's skepticism of the act or the ability to in fact get money, and then to have it. These quotation marks also act rhythmically, breaking up the sentence and creating a distinct cadence in the mind of the reader. In Joe's prose, the reader does not go long unattended. They are whispered to, elbowed in the ribs, brought along, never left behind. In a prose poem included in a letter to Nathan Kernan in 1991, Joe writes a portrait of Jimmy Schuyler a few months after his passing. Let me be a painter and close my eyes. I see brown, tweed, and blue shirt, and, surprise, yellow socks. The body sits in a chair, a king on a throne, feet glued to floor. The face is hard to picture until, click, I hear a chuckle and the voice of distant thunder. These asides have the express or coincidental, I can't say, benefit of looping the reader in, cluing them into the matter at hand, injecting reality into abstraction, a particularly useful guiding tool when things get dense, as they can sometimes do in the comics. This is some great parentheticals by Joe that I won't do the deep read that I usually do on, but are some favorites of mine. It has been noted, and will be noted again, even right now by me, that the comics are heavy. They can be riddling. Some pages wash over you like an instrumental or a wave, something you feel but can't translate. Others are sharp and clear, even laugh out loud funny. In a letter to Jimmy Schuyler from 1964, having recently reread Schuyler and John Ashbery's collaborative novel, Nest of Ninnies, Joe remarked, "It is the kind of funny I enjoy the most, because you get to give yourself a lot of credit, too, for finding it so funny." Longtime readers of the New York School know this sentiment well. Another great arrow. C comics and the comic strips and dialogues which appear within are, like much other work done by the ragtag so-called New York School, a sort of Ouroboros Russian nesting doll. Every page of the comics is a collaboration nested inside of another collaboration, a joke of a past or future joke. They're funny, cryptic, strange, sexual, in both sexy and unsexy ways, full of nudge winks, some of which have stepped so far from their reference point that you just have to accept the guts of them and move forward. It's easy now to look back at these and feel an insider's glee when starting to recognize some of these patterns, to call these moments self-referential or typical New York School, or to draw a thread of a strong, deliberate purpose through everything that was made in that period of years between the early 60s and late 70s, fueled by collaboration and youth and proximity and the city and St. Mark's Church and a certain amount of amphetamines. And yes, there was purpose and immensely artful execution there. But these works are also made of the overlapping lives of artists living blocks from each other and making constantly. The comics work like making the same joke over and over again, walking down the street with your friends until it stops being funny. And sometimes it doesn't. These comics, for a long while, have been sort of legend among those of us who trace the work and lives of Brainard, the Tulsa poets, the New York School, etc. Were no widely available scans of these works, and original issues sold with a price tag of anywhere from $500 to over $2,000, which is about $1,999 more than their original price point, if he was charging at all. Even the most enthusiastic among us have largely seen only clips and bits. I've scanned eBay listings and websites of Nick Sturm looking for scans and pages. And to have them now printed in this resolution and at this scale, and to be able to look so closely at these that you can see whether an arrow is pointing at negative space or at a speck of Mimeo is pretty good stuff. So, thank you.
Hey, hi. Ty, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. That rules. Can you see my screen? Can you see this? Okay, fantastic. Let me see if I can make this any bigger. Um, Sorry. Here we go. Um, okay. So I guess I want to talk about a problem about Rainer that has obsessed me for a very long, or not a problem. It's a feature of the work that I find endlessly charismatic, that I wonder about its sort of its afterlife, or how much of that becomes the access point to the work for me. But just as sort of a moment of preparation. So this is one of my absolute favorite entries in C Comics. This is Foreheads with Barbara Guest, and the images are some of, I think, the least cartoony of the comics, or these collaborations with Barbara Guest. We see Brainerd invoking recognizable comic iconography relatively infrequently, substituting instead what seems to be kind of like the sublime macrofauna of the American West. I'm not going to read the whole comic, but I want to leave, well, we lose that, and I want to leave this tableau on the page for just a second. If I read this letter that Brainerd sent, and again, this is also from Daniel Kane's Love Joe. This is a letter sent to Ron and Pat Paget. Hello. Um, on October 21st, 1965. Dear Pat and Ron, I am taking pills to get normal. What they do is make you hungry, so you eat a lot and then you gain weight. Also, I am drinking milk. Did you know that Zachary Scott died? I don't know why. I'm enclosing some Nancy strips because I'm sure that you must miss her, and also in hopes that it might all turn into another Ernie Paget. The one I have on my wall is not to be believed, it is so funny. I'm sorry to have misheard you in the felt pen department, but when I was in Paris, I didn't see a felt pen anywhere. I promise we're getting to the C comics in a moment. Uh, at any rate, I'm glad for you. Are they as good as ours? Some time ago, you wrote some things which I'm using as a game page for C Comics. Example, substitute one letter in my name to spell a fruit. This is okay, yes? Yes. Culture Magazine is going to use the title page. There's a thing in New York called the Foundation for Contemporary Performance Arts. They sponsor John Cage concerts, the Judson Dance Theater, Merce Cunningham, etc. At any rate, they're having a benefit exhibition in December at the Tibor de Nage and at Castelli, and 3 guesses who got invited to the show. So, blank. At least I will get to be in 3 group shows this year, if nothing else. Actress Maureen McDonald was found dead early today in her home. I have crapped out a bit concerning C Comics. Number 1, someone told Tony that I was doing a new issue and he asked me if I could do a comic too, and I said yes. Also, Barbara Guest is down in the dumps because she's not doing any writing, and you know me. I'm a sucker for women I like. This letter, this moment, this opening, this porousness of Brainerd's seems to have been the inciting incident for Foreheads, which we have in front of us, in which what seems to be a particular abstract guest poem is strung across sort of thought bubbles assigned to American macrofauna or even pieces thereof. I mean, but what I am particularly interested in, the reason that I wanted to leave the final sort of facing panels on the screen when I was reading was that what I find particularly charming, charismatic about Brainerd's work, and I have a very hard time thinking through why or how this works, is that Brainerd, I think, offers a very particular way of loving America, a method of loving America that I think is pretty inaccessible in the contemporary, and one that I don't think is grounded in a kind of naive misunderstanding of American foreign policy or any sort of denial about the stakes or how America acts on the world stage. Um, I feel very sensitive to read anything that Ron Padgett wrote while he is in this Zoom, but but Ron records this sort of beautifully mundane moment during Joe Brainard's initial draft interview for being drafted to go to Vietnam, and his admission. Well, the way that he, homosexuality becomes the premise for his designation as 4-H, being sort of charmingly, almost offhanded. but that so this is it is not that Brainerd had any illusions about American goodness or any illusions about what was represented by the United States globally, but that he nevertheless provides this access point to something that seems really sensitive, very careful, and very intimate within the kind of, bald eagle, star spangled banner language. And so I suppose I want to perhaps just sort of pause there, or I'm going to pass the rock to Tausif, but I hope that the three of us can talk about Joe Brainerd's America and whether the two of you are as charmed by it as I am.
Uh, Charmed indeed, and equally, if not more charmed by your enthusiasm for it, because I think what's been, helping me think about Joe Brainerd, my love for him, is how so many people approach Joe Brainerd in so many different ways. In some ways, I feel like a little bit of an interloper in that, but I think that's okay. I'm going to share my slides if I can figure out how to. And I'll start by okay. So I work at the Berkeley Art Museum. And in 2001, the curator Constant Llewellyn curated an exhibition of a retrospective exhibition of Joe Brainerd. And there's a catalog for it. And I want to read something that John Ashbery wrote for the catalog. It's a republication of an earlier essay, but I think it's great. Um, Joe Brainerd was one of the nicest artists I've ever known. Nice as a person and nice as an artist. This may present a problem. Think of how many artists, especially those whose work you admire, weren't all that nice. Um, and when I think about the C Comics and Joe Brainerd's work at large, I think about the statement about John Ashbery. Why does it matter if Joe Brainerd was nice? Maybe it doesn't, but to me it does, because I think it shows the kind of sensitivity that allowed for the kind of collaborations that he did. And I've always been sort of interested in Joe Brainerd between art and life. So on the screen right now are two of his works from 1968, 1967. And they're probably some of the most famous, the works by which he's most known, um, pansies. And I want to think about Joe Brainerd's heteros, in terms of masculinity and sexuality, homosexuality, but I want to kind of think about that through the word pansies. it's a double entendre if there ever were one. But I think that there's the kind of sensitivity, the kind of style, the kind of method of collaging and bringing together something that is quite beautiful in a way that allows it to be itself. Now, Connie Llewellyn talks about the idea of confrontation without provocation in these works. But I think that there's something a little bit more when we think about Joe Brainard's work leading up to this. And that work includes these collaborations with Ted Berrigan. This is a mixed media collage from 1964 that were contemporaneous with the C comics. And I just want to point out, this is called Pope Week. But you can see some of these, muscle men figures that are collaged in here. And he's making this in 1964. So around the same time that the first C comics arrive. This is collage from 1966. So Joe Brainard's making collages, but he's also making some of these stunning assemblages. And these, one of these on the left is in the Berkeley Art Museum collection. It was gifted to us by Kenred Elmsley. So much of this juxtaposition, the assemblage style, is not only just bringing together disparate things into one idea of a whole, if not the whole itself, but it's also, again, this kind of confrontation without, or provocation without confrontation. And I'm curious, in so much of these works, it's dealing with his Catholic identity, with religion, but in a way that I find extremely kind of I don't know. I would say it's a little bit funny and it's a little bit serious. And I think that, the pansy works and the collages all lead up to something of a take or a perspective on masculinity that we can see throughout the collected C comics. This is just another kind of cover that he did for Frank O'Hara's German edition of Lunch Poems. And I just love that they're dealing with mass media, they're dealing with culture in a way that is funny, but it's not pop art. I think Bill does a really good job in the essay talking about how even though it resembles pop art, there's so much more openness to the C comics than the kind of thing that Andy Warhol is doing. Yes, it's mass media. Yes, it's mass culture, but there's a kind of ability for, especially in the 1966 comics, for there to be a kind of experimentation where you can kind of enter into the work in really interesting ways. So this is from 64, his collaboration with Kenneth Koch. Boys, men, with my secret new Dynaflex method for muscle control, you can build up your body and at the same time win a precious live miniature dog. So there's an undermining of American masculinity. And David, I'm curious about how to think about the American man in the 1960s, while there at the same time there's an acknowledgement that this is the kind of idea of what a man is circulating. So I think with Frank O'Hara and Joe Brainard, heterosexuality, and it's inexorably approaching. And at the same time, there's so much openness to what Frank O'Hara is doing in his, this actually follows Foreheads. It's Hard Times after Dickens. And again, you see Frank O'Hara and Joe Brainard taking up all of these kind of hunky figures, but they're so funny. They're just so open. There's so much about this kind of, for lack of a better word, like himboism that they're taking up and then totally blasting apart. And I think, when you think of the work that comes after from Brainard, so Nancy as Mona Lisa, Nancy as a boy, if Nancy was a boy, I think there's so much happening with that taking up of masculinity's codes, scrambling them. It's sexy, but it's not necessarily super sexual in the same way. I love these tatted torsos from 1970 and this collage from 78. Again, how do we kind of think about Joe Brainard taking up in collaborations, leaving room open for what it might mean to be a man and what it mean to be a heterosexual man and what it might be a homosexual man and something in between? How do we kind of see the comics themselves as leaving space for this expression of gender and this taking up of what it is to kind of assume a gender in ways that are unexpected and funny, and I think just ultimately really very sweet. Um, and that's my spiel.
Great. That was terrific. Are there any questions first between the three of you that occur before anyone else jumps in?
I I have some thoughts on a lot of things. I was really well, I think you've both brought up points that are really integral to Joe's work, but that I think I haven't really been in like conversation about before. Um, David, I wanted to start by responding to that idea about like Joe's way of loving America because it is so true. It's really specific. One of my favorite lines from Joe, which is from Self-Portrait on Christmas Night, uh, he discusses, he says, I want to be real and do real things. And then he goes into a bit about, yeah, I want to be true. I want to be real and do real things, whether I'm blowing my nose, which I rarely find necessary, or painting an arrangement of modern, Americanized, bottled, wrapped, or boxed items, especially prepared for our sterile and functional sense of the sanitarily proper. 7-Up bottle, Pioneer instant coffee, and a Terratin dual filter cigarette. Such items I used often in my paintings, for they are present, they are the ways of my country, they are familiar, they are us, the way we dress and the expression we are forced to plaster on our faces. They are American. And I've always found, I mean, basically all of that piece of Self-Portrait on Christmas Night, which he wrote when he was 19, which is insane after a few whiskey sours. And that is so like I think pivotal to the work. And I think yeah, I think he has this optimism in the work that he interns had and did not have in his personal life, I think, which you can tell now that we have these letters to read. Um, but it allows, I think, at least me as a viewer to feel a kind of love for things that I maybe wouldn't have known how to before and has then like baked itself into my view of the world because of how integral Joe is to me. And I wonder, yeah, I don't know, Tausif, I wonder what you think about that too, and David.
I guess I wanted to respond only with like sort of show and tell, which is that Ty, your observation helps me think about this inscrutable mask in this very late um, see towards the end of the collection, this strip with James Schuyler. Oh, sorry. I'm just trying to center it because it's so weird. I'm sorry, everyone. This is terrible Zoom theater. Um, but, there is a conversation between two figures who I'm afraid I don't have the comic background to know who or if they're someone. They seem to be getting ready for a Halloween party, but that this mask just sort of appears out of nowhere in this conversation about Hilton Kramer, I suppose, is a conservative art critic in New York. Tassif, maybe you want to jump in on that, but there seems to be some sort of a it's not necessarily a revolution, then at the very least a palace coup resulting in a new leader or not. But Ty, your that passage from when he's 19 years old has me thinking very differently about how this little mask appears at this moment in what is otherwise just a really funny, pretty frisky comic about well, he writes cutting your nuts off or cutting my nuts. um, so
Yeah.
Tausif.
No, that's so, I mean, yeah, Hilton Kramer, conservative art critic, establishment par excellence, right? But I mean, I love the woodsman, the all of that. Like, I guess when you were talking about self-portrait on Christmas night and the idea that these objects are present and they enter into his paintings. I thought the immediate first thing I thought of was William Carlos Williams. The pure products of America go crazy, and I'm interested in how so much of Joe Brainard's taking up of American isms is about the impurity. It's about the fact that there isn't this kind of um, text of America. You can only approach it through the generic that toggles between the specific, right? I think that, and that's something that I've sort of used as a heuristic for understanding Joe Brainard's work writ large. From the first time I read I Remember, I always thought about how it's, specific memories that in this endless list form end up being generic ones that everyone can relate to. And I think that even in his visual art he takes up the process of repetition and assemblage and juxtaposition to very much like toggle in that same mode between the generic and the specific. So America to him, and I would say by extension masculinity for him, is this kind of similar mode of toggling between idea of a capital M man, idea of capital A America, but then also all the little things that kind of encompass it from his perspective. So yeah, I find that very useful to think about specificity and the kind of generic.
Yeah, oh sorry, David, did you want to go?
No, 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 go.
Well, I do think a lot about something that I think a lot about with Joe is like I think I think his work attains universality, like you're saying, Tausif, via ultra specificity. I was looking at the if Nancy knew what wearing green and yellow on Thursday meant the other day. And I've always kind of like that one's kind of I've just like passed over it and been like, I'm sure that means what I think it means, but I had never looked it up. And so then I took the time to like look up what does wearing green and yellow on Thursday mean? And then I texted my grandmother about it, who was born the same year as Joe, and she was like, "Well, yeah, it means you're gay." Um, and so seeing those codes and like that is an ultra specific thing, but it's also universal. And I think that's why I remember and these like 7 Up paintings and all of this stuff works. And then to the note, Tausif, of I was thinking when you were talking about sexuality and the manliness and showing the boys men comic, uh, I think like there is a certain way that Joe kind of like volleys about and then tries to sort of knock down like certain aspects of masculinity and stuff, but then that's also so couched in his like he's always like making artworks and writing about and comics about like, you know, wanting to be Tanner and like sorry for the oil on the letter, even though I promised I'd stop, or like, and then this one from the Brainerd Freeman notebooks, which I hope that people can see. Can we see this? And then at the very bottom, which I am really glad I talked about arrows because they come up in literally everything that we've now seen today. But then at the very bottom is a parenthetical that says, "And so I gave up art." Um, and I just think that's really great.
I wanted to think too. I mean, so often I love Marvelous, and I agree with both of you, and that the generic I think is a really important and fruitful category for thinking about Americanness. At the same time, his artistic engagements with its iconography are not risk-free. Ron's memoir records an early sort of Tulsa art exhibition where Brainard very much, excited about Jasper Johns exhibits a kind of collaborative artwork that detours the iconography of the American flag, and the work is banned. It's taken down. It's this early moment of censorship, and then Bill Kartalopoulos. Sorry, I want to make sure I pronounce your name correctly. But your afterwards, the C collection records that moment where the offices for Ed Sanders's magazine. Can we curse on this, Nick? Is that allowed? Okay. The offices for Fuck You magazine are raided, and of particular vexation for the police is a uh, image of Superman missing his head but with exposed genitalia. And I think Superman is Tausif, a great piece of iconography for this like hunk sir hunk that America decides that it needs the 1960s. Like the men we are making are not hot enough. We need hotter men. um, so I'm thinking too about how much is at stake quite often in these engagements that nevertheless are I think confidently, lovingly, scrupulously attentive to the minor.
Absolutely. And I want to point out kind of the inheritance of Joe Brainard's milieu, where at least in the visual arts, so you had this sort of triumphalism of abstract expressionism, and the kind of iconography for abstract expressionism is Willem de Kooning, chiseled, vaguely European, very, very much the figure for this kind of flashing style of art that becomes symbolic of post-war America. But then, and this is not an original idea, but this is Christopher Knight speaking about Andy Warhol, who kind of does this mimicking in some ways. You can read it as a mimicking of de Kooning by wearing his like silvery wig, right? So instead of the, Willem de Kooning's gray hair, you had the silvery wig of Andy Warhol. And then, Joe Brainard and his circle are actually after that, and they don't get rich in the same way that Andy Warhol does. So it's like, how do you actually take up what it means to be an artist? And Joe Brainard stops exhibiting his visual art by the 1970s because it's not quite working. They're working in a much more collaborative way. There isn't that sort of, again, triumphalism of the consumer culture that has that market. So he does pansies instead, and I think that's important to think about that context, because there is a sort of waning of America's position. I mean, Vietnam's happening right around this time, wherein they're all very much aware of that. And I think that that really kind of undergirds a lot of the sort of jokes that they make.
So Bill dropped the offending Superman image in the chat, and I just wanted to make sure I saved it.
It's excellent.
It's spectacular.
Thank you, Bill. I had never seen that.
Yeah.
My pleasure.
Yeah, Bill, I was thrilled for that detail because one of my sort of show and tell pieces, I have a copy of the the Fuck You Santa cantos that Joe provided the cover art for. These sort of late Ezra Pound fragments that I don't know if can people see just this like very kind of sexy torso that is on the front of the cantos, which is like uh, sort of unfathomable, and I would love to know if Pound actually had a response to that at any point, because it strikes me as this like marvelous way of letting a little bit of the air out of that puffed up modernist edifice to, to throw a smooth boy on the front of them. And I can't imagine Pound was particularly happy about it, but
This is so terrific. I wonder if anybody who's here in the audience has any questions that have come up or wants to add to the conversation that's been going on here. I mean, I was thinking about how this conversation about America makes me think of Brainard's devotion to Americana and how
Mhm.
Americana carries a kind of campiness, especially when it's like secondhand or sort of detritus. You can pick it up and manipulate it in certain ways. But I wondered if anyone else wanted to enter the conversation.
Well, actually, I could add something about the cantos of Ezra Pound. I don't know if Pound ever saw them in this form, but I do know that the publication history was interesting. Um, Apparently, I think Donald Hall, the poet and one-time editor of the Paris Review, I think had interviewed Pound or met him or somehow came into possession of these unpublished later cantos. And for some reason, Don Hall passed them on to the poet Tom Clark, who had been Hall's favorite student at the University of Michigan and who went on and became a wonderful poet and also the editor of the Paris Review. So Tom Clark was in possession of these bootleg manuscripts, and he passed them on to Ed Sanders, who jumped at the chance to publish them in an unauthorized edition from what Ed on the title page put from a secret location on the Lower East Side. And and Ed knew Joe, and so he got Joe to do the cover, and Joe, as always, graciously jumped in and did it right away. And so that's a little bit of that strange publishing history of the cantos.
That makes tons of sense, Ron, because Donald Hall was who interviewed Ezra Pound for the Paris Review for their Art of Poetry interview. So I bet that was when that happened.
I wanted to point out a comment that Andrew Epstein, hi Andrew, made about the Vermont Notebook as being a key place for Brainard's interest in Americana. And there's a funny thing about the Vermont Notebook, which was a collaboration with John Ashbery, but Joe Brainard was kind of like pissed off about it in the sense that he didn't think of it was a real true collaboration because the poems had already been written. So he remarked that, quote, I divided it by pages and I started in the middle and just tried to add to the poem, but not illustrate it. I tried to relate at certain points, but in factual ways, not emotional ways, end quote. And I think, Connie Llewellyn has a remark about how that's typical of how Brainard works with text. He didn't like how illustrations were too specific to the text. He wanted to have something free and loose and open. And I think the C comics, especially toward the end, have that ability. It's something, Bill's essay does such a great job of explaining that it's like it's not pop art. It's not this kind of modernist sort of thing. It's something else besides. It's something, that is more than the product of just collaboration itself. It has a kind of openness to it. And I think that is really helpful when I think about Joe Brainard's work across this time, where the assemblages too have this kind of hermeneutic openness to them, even as there are so many iconic Americana figures, Catholic symbols. It's not that, it is something more, and it's something more than just the combination of the two.
I also was thinking about just while we're on icons, I was thinking about Tausif, uh your mention of like Joe's use of religious iconography and he especially in those like big constructions, so much of that is like crosses and little Marys and he then later interpolated Nancy into like various religious scenes. And I guess the way that I've always understood that, and I guess what I'm doing now is just sort of polling a room of people who have also been thinking about this, um, is I feel like there's something about his treatment of these figures that feels more like these icons are being treated only as icons, right? Thou shalt not make a graven image, right? But these are only graven images. Like, the Virgin Mary is being treated very much like Marilyn Monroe or, Lana Turner or whatever, like these figures that people looked up to, and more like kind of a celebrity than anything else. And I wonder if that's how you guys read those, or if that contradicts something.
In the image where I showed him taking up the Mona Lisa and drawing on that, I think like it's almost like he acknowledges that by that point in time, the Virgin Mary, the Mona Lisa, all these kinds of iconic figures that have a kind of sacrality to them have already been so mass produced that they're the equivalent of Nancy. I think like in again in a very different way than Warhol at all were doing, where so much about that is almost cynical or perhaps like um I don't know, like a deflation of their sort of value vis-a-vis reproduction. I think Joe Brainard works in almost the opposite way, where it's like in the time that I've come of age, these are basically on the same level. It's not about taking one to the level of the other. It's already there. And I like that. I like the kind of equanimity of Joe Brainard's work. I think that that happens in the prose, that happens in the comics, and that's why I think collaboration is so important to him. It's a first among equals in whether it's visual art and writing or vice versa.
I want to just sort of echo and share and point to another moment. This is in the People of the World Relax comic, and I wanted to point out that the way that the iconography of the American flag often appears in the C comics is to my mind consequentially different from the way that he often uses Nancy, who is recontextualized, added to, experiences any number of uh, artistic perversions, but still always seems coherently Nancy. Whereas the flag, and I think that this is a method of both, in kind of comic illustration technique, rendering motion on the page, but it also appears incomplete. And there is this sense that, like, the American flag stands in for a project that is unfinished in a way that Nancy's project is iterative, it is exciting, it is, surprising it will appear juxtapositionally, but her project is disruptive in a way that I think that the work takes very seriously the idea of an unfinished project of America.
Bill, I wondered if I could invite you to say something briefly about your experience of editing the book and how that, since we have the pleasure of you being here, how it maybe added to your understanding of Brainerd or the comics by compiling this for NYRB.
Sure, thank you. Well, thanks for inviting me. Yeah, I mean, I did a lot of research behind the reprint, and I put as much of that as I could into 4,000 words, but my first draft was like 10,000 words. Because anyone who's been up to the
Standard.
Beinecke, this is like an extraordinarily like well documented slash self-documented group of people. And that was great though, because I honestly didn't know how much I was going to find when I started researching, and was very pleased to find a lot of other material. I mean, there's all kinds of other sort of loose threads that I think I'm going to continue to be working with. There are some kind of like anyway, so yeah, I mean, even relating to C comics, one thing, this isn't a direct answer to your question, but actually, I was just thinking about when David was talking about the incomplete American flags and so on, and also I guess this connects to what Tausif, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your first name. Um, it happens to me a lot. But anyway, what you were saying too about the difference with pop art, and some of it has to do with like, and this relates as well to like the images of the Virgin Mary and so on, and part of it is this idea of um, he sometimes it seems like he's drawing images that are almost images of images. When I'm thinking to, but there's also always a real kind of what feels like an almost like intuitive intentionality about what to leave in and what to take out, or what to leave out, or what to needs to be put in. Even with like I was thinking like the American flags are kind of like those male torsos in some ways. And I think some of it is about like a kind of focus of trying to figure out like what's the telling detail, what's the thing that gives the thing its thingness, sort of. And I think that's sort of part of it. How much can you like leave out and it still has its integrity? And I think the thing with Nancy is she's just kind of a molecule, and she just has, it's like a sticker, it's like a rubber stamp, it's like a have a nice day face. I mean, and I think that's part of the appeal, that it is kind of, and I mean, in a way I have, like mixed feelings about sort of contributing to the sort of like ongoing project of like fetishizing Nancy, because I come from the comics world and I think people sometimes go a little overboard with that. But nevertheless, I mean, that's definitely part of the appeal, is that there's this sense that it's like kind of this completely like architecturally coherent kind of thing, without a single extra line or detail. And then to kind of, talk about comics a little bit too, when you think about the process behind this, usually, not always, but usually, he would be drawing comics pages without any text in them, and especially with the early stuff, like in C Comics #1, or as well in some of the kind of early stuff that wasn't printed or published. I mean, sometimes, somebody was reading, um, like that I think it was a Jimmy Schuyler text earlier. No, I'm sorry, it was one of the Kenneth Koch texts. And it was basically like a cross between a couple of the text was just a cross of a couple different ads from comic books, like a Charles Atlas kind of ad and the miniature dogs thing. So it's like you almost have this kind of collage thing of like text from one source and images from another source, and they're being put together, and everything's attributed to the writer and the artist, but they're also both referring to other things. So that's one thing. But also too, just thinking about those like blank, like, or comics pages like vacated of words before they're handed to the poets to fill in. It's like, and that's interesting to consider too, because one of the things that I found were two alternate versions of texts for The Earth Machine by Kenneth Koch, um, with different titles. One of them's called Orangutans, and I forget what the other one was called. So it's like that could, and not only did Kenneth Koch write alternate texts, he used the pages in different orders as well. So it's like the variations. But anyway, but when you imagine like this comics page without any text in it, um, it almost, I mean, it's almost like a drawing of a comics page, but then that gets activated by the addition of the text. Suddenly, it doesn't have, I mean, one of the things that characterizes comics and makes it different from other kinds of art is that you have these like multiple images that are presented together. But one of the things that the comics artist does is structure the reader's attention, and that relates to the arrows too. I mean, that's the first job of the comics artist. And because I also teach studio as well as studying comics, is to move the reader's attention around the page, to lead the reader's eye, to make, to create a sense of like flow from image to image, or to have a conscious like juxtaposition that denies flow, whatever that is. But the point is you're structuring the reader's attention, and that's certainly something those arrows do. But, when there's no text in it, it's almost like it's sort of static, it's like a picture of a comics page, but then it gets activated and it becomes something that's active when that poetic language sort of inhabits those word balloons and empty spaces that he lends, to the poetic language. So I don't know. Those are I don't know if that's focused enough, but those are some of the reactions that I had to some of the things that came up over the last several minutes.
It's fantastic, Bill. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry for mangling your surname. I just wanted to throw into view for everyone precisely one of those static arrows that you were talking about at the center of that panel that I was talking about from People of the World Relax. There's this great panel with just an arrow directing us to what exactly? It's so funny in the middle of what is otherwise a kind of a series of sort of homilies, encouragements to sort of live your truth, baby. There's just this sort of marooned arrow.
Yeah, and I mean it's been quoted a lot, including in my essay, but that was I think you can well, first of all, but he said like, he was drawing these comics directly in ink without penciling first, and that's where, he'd make errors and cross them out, and he just started to kind of appreciate that. But I think too that there's something of Ted Berrigan's influence there as well, just kind of admitting the mistake into the work is, I think, I think a lot of it even goes back to the very first collaboration that they did, the comics collaboration, the personal Nancy Love that was in the Columbia Review. I mean, I think, you can and you see throughout C Comics, whenever Ted Berrigan gets involved, like the standard method of collaboration completely goes by the wayside, and it's really much more something that just looks like, like in French, when two people collaborate on something, they say it was done by four hands, and it kind of feels like almost there are four hands moving across the paper, at the same time with like ink dribbled all over the place. And like I'm thinking in particular of Pat from the second issue of C Comics. So yeah, anyway, but yeah, I mean, I think that embracing the error and the accident is something that comes very much from the collaborations with Ted for sure.
Yeah, it reminded me of this one, Stamp Out the Family Plan from C Comics 1. I did a close reading of this comic in my essay on Brainard's comics and really enjoyed these two pieces here where it's the lined notebook paper with Berrigan's handwriting. So there's like a collage element to the panel that we don't see in other instances of Brainard's collaborations, and the same like materiality of actually cutting out a piece of another piece of paper.
That also, the TED thing that I was just jumping around in this book, but oh Jesus. But this work, which is this is the worst possible way I could show this. But at the bottom there's an arrow pointing to a square that or a rectangle that says a rectangle for Ted to do something in. And I just love the way that this very specific collaborative trust between them is evidenced in the comics and in, I think, very specifically that Ted's handwriting, you don't see a lot of other people's handwriting in Joe's visual work and in the comics, but Ted's when you see it. I mean, like any handwriting would stand out next to Joe's, but Ted's, and it's like I think there's a really specific uh feeling that is brought about by that visual occurrence and by that collaboration.
Although, if I could add one thing, I mean, you say trust, but I think there's also a kind of quality of containment there too, I mean, because I was, yeah, and I spoke with Johnny Stanton of Siamese Banana fame, um, one of the couple of people who I was able to talk to who had collaborated with Joe on these comics, and and he was someone who really kind of let me in on just kind of that process of Joe kind of just giving the, sort of wordless comics to the artists. But and I don't remember exactly how I phrased the question. But I said, was this sort of a way of kind of having some sort of like control over the finished product. And Johnny said, yeah, control is the word, and I get the feeling that, the kind of like, because when Joe and the his peers from Tulsa came to New York, the scene that they entered was already collaborative. Like there was already that practice of collaboration, like if you think of like stones, the series of lithographs, for example, that Frank O'Hara worked on with like Larry Rivers, like there was already that there. But I think my feeling is that Joe was a little perhaps I mean, this was a way where he could open a space in his artwork for other people to make a contribution while still feeling that the final result would satisfy his aesthetics. Because the text could be whatever the text was going to be, but he had delineated where the text was going to go, you know. So, and to me, that I also found that page, which I think was in one of Ted's diaries at Columbia, if I'm not mistaken. And that was something that really kind of I noticed very, very much when I saw that there, that rectangle for Ted to do something in, I think is kind of part of the method behind the comics in a way. It's like, here's the space for the writers to do something in.
I think yeah, I think that's totally right. And what feels notable about that is the timeline of the C comics and the fact that between Self-Portrait on Christmas Night and moving to New York and the creation of the C comics was Joe's stint in Boston, which has been talked about largely as like, him kind of needing a break from folks and from things and from the city and, Ted and whatever. But yeah, I think coming back and doing the comics and finding a way to have a certain amount of control is a really interesting read on that.
Okay. Unless there's any other questions, we could do one more perhaps, if anyone has anything on their mind. Andrew, Peggy. Okay. Well, it's been a pleasure listening to this conversation. Thank you, Ron and Bill, as well. And thank you all for coming. If you don't already have the book from NYRB, please order a copy. And let's make sure that Bill sends out his 10,000 word version of the introduction that we all really, really want to read. That's going on our list of things that we need. Please follow the Network for New York School Studies on Blue Sky or on Instagram. We have our next event will be at the end of March, March 26th. We'll have a Frank O'Hara birthday eve marathon reading on what would be his 100th birthday. So we'll have 2 hours of poets reading O'Hara poems. So it'll be a lot of fun. Thank you, the three of you, so much for your time this evening. Hope to see you all soon in person. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you guys so much. This was so fun.
Thanks so much. Yeah, this is great.
Yeah, I
Bye.
learned tons too. Thanks, guys.
Total blast. And if you're in New
Total.
York, come on to the 11th to Joe's birthday.
That's right. Yeah,
Yes.
next Wednesday,
Yeah.
March
Okay.
11th.
Amazing.
Thanks, Nick. Good night.
Bye.
Hi, Peggy. Yeah, it's so good to have all of your affects in the same place. It's really.
Well, it was really, really fun to be here. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.